Good evening, everybody, and welcome once again to The Sacred Life. Once again, I am your host, David Baylor. It is good to be here with you all once again. And tonight, for this episode tonight, it's kind of a continuation and a conclusion and a wrap up of what we've talked about the last 2 weeks when talking about the Anabaptists of the Swiss Reformation. Kind of tying some loose ends together in those last 2 episodes in this historical series. I was looking in particular at dispelling some myths about the Swiss Anabaptists and the radical Reformation, but then also laying some important groundwork in terms of what sort of forces were present at the time of the Reformation. And now tonight, my aim is to kind of take all of that and wrap it up and present a more conclusive picture of who the Swiss Anabaptists actually were and are, where what we recognize today as like the Swiss Mennonites and the Amish and those various traditions that come from those origins, like who they actually were, where they actually came from. Because again, a major motivation of mine is to dispel this idea that who the Anabaptist people, who the Mennonite people are, they are the heirs of the radical Reformation. This is something, again, as I pointed out previously, is kind of a myth that was invented by their detractors, while at the same time containing certain elements of truth. Anyway, I do want to welcome everybody once again, and I'm glad to have you all here. Just remind everybody once again, please consider checking out the links in the description. Please consider becoming a channel member if you enjoy this kind of content, whether you're watching it live, if you're watching it later as a video on demand. There are ways that you can support what we're doing here at the Sacred Life, help us to continue to grow. And just a little bit of a clarification as to what we actually do here. It might be confusing if you don't understand how all of our different things are tied together. Is that we're trying to look at Christianity, at the history of the church, at what we believe as Christians, and really our experience in life from a much more what you might call philosophical perspective. And so all of these things are tied together, what might seem as somewhat disconnected topics if you don't understand what our actual, I guess you could say, theme of this channel is. Looking at things like church history, looking at things like philosophy, medieval literature, symbolism, and things like that. These all tie together because kind of like what our goal here at the Sacred Life is to sort of reestablish what it means to be something like a complete person. And so that's kind of what we're doing. And so that's why we're talking about, like tonight, we're talking about history. We're talking about the history of the Swiss Anabaptists and the Reformation, because that's our background here at the Sacred Life. That's our cultural and religious heritage, even though none of us are actually still Mennonites today. We highly value, we love and respect our tradition. And, even though we've left that tradition, we're not like trying to burn it down and discredit it and everything. Yeah, so once again, like, you can check out the links in the description. We do have a project ongoing, the Voice of the Blood animated Lives of the Saints series. And as I said, as I've announced a few times already, and once again remind everybody, we're also working on producing those as radio dramas. So that's something we will have coming up. There's a Patreon if you'd like to support that project. We'd really appreciate it. Although I understand probably not a lot of people are going to support it until we actually have something to show for it. And we don't really expect you to do that. But it is there if, at least it's there for the future. If you do choose to support it now, we'd greatly appreciate that. Of course, you can become a channel member if you want to support this kind of content. Drop super chats. If you're watching this as a video on demand, drop super thanks, things like that. We appreciate all of you tuning in, and please consider liking this video, sharing this video, subscribing to this channel, sharing our other videos. Check out our other videos. We've got quite a few. We talk about a wide variety of topics that we hope are interesting and valuable to you. And also, I'm an Orthodox iconographer, and I'm also the sponsor of the Sacred Life. So you can check out my links for my iconography in the description. You can order custom hand painted icons. I also do custom commissions, so you can check that out as well. So anyway, getting back into the topic of tonight's video. Like I said, I'm trying to connect kind of like wrap up the threads that I've laid in the previous episodes in this historical series, where in those I was more focused on kind of dispelling some of the myths and laying some of the groundwork, establishing like here's what's actually going on in the Reformation with the Swiss Anabaptists, and here's why some of these narratives are not necessarily true. And so I thought it would be pretty important, after I've kind of said that, being critical of what often happens in like popular scholarship or even like lay scholarship among Anabaptists. I've laid the criticism of that, so I think it's important now to lay out. Okay, here's what actually happened. Here's the true story. And again, why is this important? Why is this important? Part of the reason this is important is kind of for my own people. Like, even though I've walked away from that, I do still love my people. And I think that the way in which we have retold our story has been harmful to our people. It's one of the biggest factors contributing to like the absolute shattering of the Anabaptist, the Mennonite world in recent decades. That seems to only be accelerating in our day. And because I think I think it's very valuable for us kind of in understanding what has happened in Christianity and in the Christian world more broadly to look at these things. There's a lot of very, very interesting, very intriguing things about the Anabaptist part of the Reformation that I think will open up a lot of doors to help us understand church history, medieval church history in particular, a little more clearly. Now, so I mentioned that the story has been recast, the story has been retold in kind of a new way that's not really accurate, and I think it would be worth pointing out kind of where that comes from. So where this originates, you might be surprised. Well, I guess if you've seen the previous episodes, you understand. You've heard me claim this isn't the way Anabaptists ever conceived of themselves previously. This isn't the story that we told about ourselves in the past, and it's actually surprisingly modern that this way of looking at things kind of arises. It's actually in 1943. With a Mennonite scholar by the name of Harold S. Bender, who publishes a writing called The Anabaptist Vision, in which he portrayed Anabaptism as a principled, discipleship-centered movement that originated with Zurich's 1525 adult baptisms. And so he envisions Anabaptism as like a radical faithfulness in the face of the compromise of the magisterial reformers in Zurich and in Switzerland. And part of his motivation there was to try to recover an Anabaptist identity during World War II, when there were a lot of pressures on the Mennonites and the Amish to conform, to kind of surrender their distinctives, especially things in terms of like the use of the German language. And certainly like their refusal to fight in the war and to support the war effort were also something they were facing a lot of pressure over. So this kind of arises in that setting. But as I said, it is a massive shift, and it's one that seems to have really been adopted by Mennonite people. Even though the context that he's writing, he's directing it more at what we would think of as the liberal Mennonite church. And his way of looking at things really is a product of theological liberalism, which by this period in time has pretty thoroughly taken over the mainline Mennonite church. And this is actually one of the reasons for the emergence of old order movements, and then later the conservative movements against these tendencies of theological liberalism within the broader Mennonite kind of community, the broader Mennonite church. So his way of looking at the story really is I would characterize it as like he is projecting his own theological liberalism backwards on something that had occurred 500 years before his time. And of course, there's some serious errors that, like as I've already said, I don't need to repeat that, but have result in a lot of issues that maybe he didn't foresee, and it has left his church, it has left the Mennonite community in a pretty desperate state today. So what really did happen? What is the true story? I've done a lot of saying, well, this story isn't true, and now I need to say what actually happened. And so the first thing that we have to understand is that the early days of the Reformation were really quite a chaotic time. This is true all over Europe. That Martin Luther's, we like to point to Martin Luther's nailing of the 95 Thesis or whatever. I'm sorry if I get the number wrong off the top of my head here. Nailing the theses to the door of the cathedral as like this is the like this incredible moment that is the start of the Protestant Reformation, when really that's not quite how it worked. It's much more nebulous and much more chaotic. This is certainly like Martin Luther is a catalyzing figure, but really this kind of Reformation fervor had been going on for quite a while already by the time of Martin Luther. And it's something that just kind of is boiling all over Western Europe at the time, and really explodes during the time of Martin Luther, and then with the rise of figures like Ulrich Zwingli, and a number of other reformers as well. Um, but it's not just limited to these magisterial reformers, because we also have what is really often lumped together, thrown together into this label of Anabaptists. So many people that really have no distinct connection to each other, and this becomes a difficulty that the more established and mature Anabaptist groups are going to face later on, is they are getting lumped together with like some very questionable radical groups. And so what we do have to understand is that what happens in 1525 in Zurich, when you have Conrad Grebel, Felix Manz, and George Blaurock performing the first adult baptisms. This is a significant moment, to be certain, but it's one of several such moments. And it's kind of become the narrative, like I've said, like I already established in a previous episode, but I'll recap that real quick, that it is kind of through the work of Berchtold Haller. He's the Bern reformer. But the heir of Zwingli, for some reason, his name isn't coming to me off the top of my head. The heir of Zwingli, who writes his own history of the Anabaptist people. And he kind of pushes this idea forward that all of the Anabaptists are the descendants of these people who were, his former friends, who were once, co-workers with Zwingli in the early stages of the Zurich Reformation. But what the truth is that most Swiss Anabaptists actually have very little connection to this Zurich group. So we do have the figures that I mentioned already. Conrad Grebel, Felix Manz, George Blaurock, and then there's also Balthasar Hubmaier, who's another influential early Anabaptist figure connected with the Swiss Brethren. What distinguishes these people, and I would argue sets them apart from what we would understand as the Swiss Anabaptist tradition as it continues in the following decades and centuries, is that these men are all very highly educated scholars. They have a very scholastic, very rationalistic, and very humanistic approach to theology. So they're setting forward like this very systematic approach to theology, this very systematic approach to biblical scholarship. But what they lay down, what they teach, and what they establish is not something that's going to characterize the Mennonite faith that emerges, in the 1530s and 40s and into the 1550s. Instead, there's two other figures that I'm going to present to you tonight that are much, much more important, and those are, of course, Michael Sattler and Pilgrim Marpeck. And what is different about these individuals is that they kind of lay aside this extremely rationalistic, scholarly approach to theology, and they arise more out of this, the stream of German mysticism that we established in a previous episode. Um, and so these two individuals are both actually connected to this in different ways. Michael Sattler uh, was himself a Benedictine monk who left the monastery during the time of the Reformation, gets married and all that. Very scandalous very scandalous at the time. But he is he's very, very closely connected with this current of German Rhineland mysticism, the Benedictine community that he was a part of. And so he's a figure that brings this monastic way of thinking and this deeply mystical way of thinking with him into the church. And so, of course, he is actually the figure that kind of ties together all these disparate movements that are kind of mixed together, oftentimes in conflict with each other, and convenes a synod in Schleitheim, Switzerland, in 1527, and kind of unites them into a single cohesive movement. But even more significant than his theologies and his action would be the teaching and the actions of Pilgrim Marpeck. Now, Pilgrim Marpeck, he was originally from Austria. He was like a very highly educated. He was actually like a civil engineer and a mining engineer by profession. But one like his a significant contribution that he would bring is that he is a student. He's a student of a number of medieval mystical writings, in particular the Theologia Germanica and the writings of Bernard of Clairvaux. And so these very mystical medieval writings, and these become very, very instrumental in the Anabaptist movement as it is kind of formulated and established. And even more, perhaps even more, I would definitely say even more important than this, is Pilgrim Marpeck redefines the Anabaptist approach to theology and grounds it in incarnational theology. And now, for me personally, this was actually a pretty significant thing, because when I'm looking into Anabaptist history to try to understand, this question that I was presenting earlier, what's happened to our faith, what's happened to our communities, things are like fracturing and falling apart, and they've been kind of going sideways for a long time. Going back to like my grandparents' generation, even great grandparents' generations, these have just gone completely sideways. And it's like we've lost our way, we've lost our identity, we've lost any understanding of who we are and what we believe, and things have just kind of collapsed in various ways. So like I'm really studying this, and as I start encountering Pilgrim Marpeck, I discover this incarnational theology, which really arises from a deep love and a deep study of very early patristic writing. But this is particularly sorry, I'm tongue tied tonight. This is particularly important in the formation of what comes to be the Swiss Anabaptist, South German Anabaptist community, in contrast to the Dutch Mennonites. From what I can tell, the Dutch Mennonites very much originate as and remain into the future a strain of like radical reformed theology. But with the rise of Michael Sattler, and then especially with the rise of Pilgrim Marpeck, what we see in the Swiss communities ultimately comes to be a rejection of the Reformed paradigm, the rejection of Reformed theology, and a return to like a medieval mystical incarnational theology. And this is particularly important. So Marpeck is a staunch critic of the approach to symbolism and allegory and literalism that is preferred by Zwingli, by John Calvin, and by figures like this. Um, and he's a very very staunch critic and opponent of like the spiritualism that is so central to the Reformed way of thinking as it has arisen in his day. And like I said, this arises because he regrounds Anabaptist thinking in incarnational theology. Now, I think where I stand today, that obviously there's quite a lot I disagree with Marpeck about, um, but I highly respect I highly respect what he was trying to do and what he stood for, and I think it's pretty significant to the formation of the Anabaptist identity. And so, if we look, for example, at the writings of Ernst Müller, he wrote a book in 1895. Just for reference, Ernst Müller, he was a Swiss Reformed pastor in the Emmental region of the canton of Bern, and in 1895 he published a work, Geschichte der Bernischen Täufer, which would be the history of the Bernese Anabaptist. And he is looking at this question. He's looking at some of the factors we've laid out previously concerning the Anabaptist stories that they told about themselves. And one thing he notes in particular is that the sort of official narrative that's been set forward by the state, which is that the Anabaptists are all these offshoots of the radical Reformation that spun off of the Zwingli Zurich Circle. Like he just like this doesn't line up with who these people actually are and where they actually live. And like one thing that he noted is that the regions in the canton of Bern where this Anabaptist faith really took hold are quite a bit different in a lot of ways than the communities where this Zurich group was popular in the earlier uh, 1500s. That Zurich group was eventually eradicated by the Zurich authorities. Some of them would have some of them would flee to South Germany, to Freiburg, and to other places, and kind of be assimilated into the broader Anabaptist community that had emerged by that time. But Mueller noted that in contrast to those people who were oftentimes like well-educated merchants, people from higher, wealthier classes, and in contrast, the Bernese Anabaptists were rural people. They were poor farmers, and they were people that were very, very known, very, very widely known for like their skepticism of anything foreign, anything outside. Very, very well known for their staunch conservatism. And one criticism that he set forward is like these people aren't just going to like wholeheartedly accept the like this radical new religion in the way that the authorities claim they did. And just for some context for that, there were periods in in the late 1500s and into the 1600s where Anabaptism in regions of like the Upper Emmental, regions of the Bernese Oberland, which is like the Alpine region of the canton of Bern, where there were like entire villages that the Bernese authorities considered these people are Anabaptists. And Mueller is like this just doesn't match up. And so he was a famous proponent of this idea of the Anabaptist being a pre-Reformation movement. Um, and really, a lot of what I think happened is that these communities, which kind of had this this very like folksy approach to Christianity for centuries and centuries. They were very often isolated and kind of separated from the mainstream scholastic trends that were going on in the major population centers of Western Europe, and in a lot of ways like had really managed to hold on to this this more folk, I don't know, this more folksy, this more mystical, um, I would argue this older iteration of the Western medieval approach to Christianity. That like these people, after the traditional structures of the Catholic Church had been ripped out by the Reformation and replaced with this dogmatic rationalistic teaching of the Reformed Church, that they were just kind of disconnected from this. And so this, like, they were very, very receptive then to the Anabaptist faith as it was defined by figures like Pilgrim Marpeck. And he was very active in these regions. He lived for, I think it was like 12 years. It's just like an itinerant. I don't think preacher is really quite the right word, but he would just travel around to these communities and live with these people and help, like, help teach them, help them spiritually in various ways. And so, like, these people were very receptive to that kind of version of the Anabaptist faith. And so, like, what I'm presenting is that the the faith as it was defined by Pilgrim Marpeck is what would go on to be the Anabaptist religion into the later half of the 16th century, into the 17th century. And that's what has been passed down, is kind of the foundation of the Mennonite and Amish faiths as they exist today. And so what winds up happening in the 20th century is, through the adoption of theological liberalism, um, through the adoption of this rational scholasticism, the Anabaptist movement winds up betraying its own heritage, and that the radical Reformation model that's pressed forward by figures like Harold S. Bender end up being a complete betrayal of the Anabaptist faith as it had existed for 400 years by that time, and just create something that is pretty much completely disconnected from its own history, its own heritage. And this matters to me because, like, for one thing, like I've said, I think it's one of the things that is directly responsible for the dire state that the Anabaptist tradition finds itself in today. I think that Anabaptist churches are hopeless and are never going to find any kind of solution for the problems that they're facing as long as they continue running down this road that they've been running down that's been causing all of their problems. But I think if we look at Marpeck and we look at his writings, and if we look at the Anabaptist faith as it existed in, say, the 17th century, we'll find something. For me, what I find in it ultimately is something that allows me actually to connect with ancient Christianity, and I think that's very, very important because with the Radical Reformation model, which the Radical Reformation model is pretty important, pretty informative to American Christianity, like evangelical Christianity, charismatic Christianity as it exists today, which has really, like, taken up the spirit of the Radical Reformation in a lot of ways, and I would say has, like, wholesale adopted the worst ideas of the radical Anabaptist reformers. And in turn, what I say today is that Mennonites have wholesale adopted the bad ideas that figures like Michael Sattler and Pilgrim Marpeck, like, deliberately singled out and said, these things are bad, these things will destroy us, these things are not Christian, they're not good, we have to get rid of these things. And now we've brought those things all back in, and those things are very widespread in American Christianity today. But instead, this aspect of incarnational theology, it was something that was very transformative for me, and being able then, through the writings of Marpeck and some of these other figures, to discover the writings of the church fathers and figuring out, like, what the actual aim, what the actual goal of the Swiss Mennonites was not, like, to establish a radical new faith based strictly on, like, this extremely scholastic and rationalistic sola scriptura approach, because this is something that figures like Pilgrim Marpeck really moderated, really throttled down. And the Swiss Anabaptists would go on to be like far less dedicated to sola scriptura than the Reformed Protestants were. Um, but being able to connect ourselves to the patristic tradition of the church, and being able to look at church history and see the Holy Spirit as having worked throughout the history of His people. And for me, obviously, that's something that leads to me becoming Orthodox. And honestly, like I'm not ashamed to say, I wish that all of my people, all of the Anabaptist people, could understand our kinship actually with Orthodox Christianity. Um, I'm going to go ahead and look at the comments. Just to remind everybody, I will be looking at the comments, addressing your comments, doing some live Q&A. Somebody has left an audio recording. I don't know. It's not actually. Sorry. It's just a very clever use of characters. I was just gonna ask, like, how do you even do that? But you know, um, anyway, yeah. So people have questions. If they have comments related to the topic of this video or any of our other videos, leave those, and I will do some Q&A at the time. Um, but yeah, just to kind of recap what I'm saying, I've laid out a lot of threads here, and I do need to kind of tie that all together. That what really happens in the Reformation is that you do have a lot of scattered radical Reformation groups, um, and the Zurich Brethren, and what we see, what is often called the Swiss Brethren, is certainly an important one of these groups, but it is very much inaccurate to say this is the foundation of the Mennonites. This is the foundation of the Anabaptist movement. Rather, it's to say, this is one of many movements. They had some ideas, some teachings, some writings that would be somewhat influential on later generations. But it's inaccurate to see them as the starters of this movement, of like this Holy Spirit filled movement that then took off. Um, because for the most part, the Anabaptist movement that emerged in the following decades had very, very little to do with them. And instead, it was figures like Michael Sattler and especially Pilgrim Marpeck that are responsible for the Anabaptist faith that would, be so prominent, especially in regions like the canton of Bern and regions of southern Germany in the following decades. And that it is like this it's actually like this moderation away from the radical Reformation, and then like these radical versions of the Reformed paradigm. And it's this moderation away from like this extreme uncompromising sort of faith of figures like Conrad Grebel that is key to the success of the Anabaptist movement. Like, I think if it was just Conrad Grebel's movement, um, that this wouldn't have lasted very long. It wouldn't have had a very significant impact on the world. It would have died out rather quickly, and it did die out. Like, his movement did die out rather quickly. But instead, like I said, it's this regrounding of the faith in a medieval understanding, and especially in incarnational theology, that is the success of Anabaptism. And it's something that in turn allows Anabaptism to become something that is tremendously influential on the formation of the modern world, for better or for worse. I think in some ways for worse, in some ways for better. But and especially like this focus on incarnational theology, and it's been to the detriment of the Anabaptist communities and to the world that this understanding of things was lost There's a number of reasons why these things were lost. It's not fair to say these people were just like completely careless. A lot of the reason for kind of the degradation of this way of thinking was because of very intense and deliberate persecution. But there's a lot more going on than that. So anyway, I hope that kind of ties it all up. Um, what I would kind of like to go, where I would kind of like to go from here is to jump back about 500 years, maybe 600 years before this, um, and start looking at some medieval church history. Medieval church history is something that's long fascinated me, and in these last 3 videos on Anabaptist church history, I've kind of touched on some of those themes, and I'd really like to go back and look at some of that. So that's kind of where this historical series will go next. What I'm trying to do, just kind of in terms of schedule, is to do a history focused topic probably once a week, and do a um, like do 2 other videos a week on other topics related to especially related to like philosophy and symbolism, and even things like medieval legends and literature and hagiography and things like that. And so that's kind of the rough schedule going forward, and hopefully we'll be able to have the 3 of us, myself, my brother John, and Aaron. We'll be able to have some videos with the 3 of us here again in the near future. um, Anyway, that's all I have for tonight. I don't know if anybody has any actual relevant questions. I see a lot of chatter going on, and I appreciate all your comments, even the nonsense ones. That helps the algorithm. So you go ahead and leave all that there. Um, Yeah, Rodol, I don't know. I'm just going to call you Rodolph. You say I certainly don't interact with your views. That kind of depends actually on the video. On a video like this, I'm going to stay a lot more on task and focused. If it's something that lends itself more to interaction with nonsensical comments, then I will interact with them. But, a video like this, where I am presenting a historical content, it's kind of hard to, stop what I'm doing and address every crazy little blip that pops up. Yeah, like I said, for video like this, if you have a comment that's relevant to this video, to this historical discussion, please leave that. Otherwise, your other comments, you can join in at another time and leave those on a video that's not like where it's not like completely has nothing to do with what I'm talking about. Um, yeah, so thanks everybody for joining us tonight. I hope this, I don't know, I hope it's interesting. It's something that's very interesting to me. I enjoy studying this kind of history, and I like I don't know. It's something I've worked through a lot to try to understand. Partially to try to understand what's going on. There's always been something that's been deeply unsettling to me about this radical Reformation understanding of things, because honestly, that's not virtuous. That's not good. That's not something that I would really admire. I would really think very highly of. If we're just like the most radical people, because really, I don't know. Like, my concern with that is it kind of creates an environment where it's like the person who could be the most dogmatic and stubborn and digging in his heels and be the most like hubristic and prideful about his understanding of things is the most virtuous one. It's like, no, actually that's the opposite of the truth. Like, that's just stubborn pride, and like it's really diabolical in a lot of ways. And so like I don't like that. I think if that's who the Anabaptist people are, that's a pretty big problem. But I also don't think that's who the Anabaptist people are. Um, and I hope this kind of opens opens a door for discussion with my own people about some of these subjects. And I want, I guess, like I want to lay out a compelling case for, why this narrative has been bad for us. And hopefully it's useful to people who aren't Anabaptists to understand why it is that the stories that we tell and the way we present historical narratives is actually pretty important, and there's always an agenda behind it. Anyway, that's all I have for tonight. Once again, remind everybody to check out the link in the descriptions. Once again, I am the sponsor of The Sacred Life. I am an Orthodox iconographer. You can check out the links to my iconography website in the description. Would appreciate it if you'd consider purchasing a hand-painted icon. These are all hand-painted icons that I do using traditional methods and materials. And I do custom work. I do commissions and stuff like that as well. And you can also consider becoming a channel member if you appreciate what we're doing here at The Sacred Life. If you're interested in this this kind of historical content, if you're interested in discussions of philosophy, if you're interested in discussions of like medieval art and literature and those things, those are kind of the sort of stuff that we do here, because those are all kind of tied together in our, I guess you would call our philosophy of beauty that kind of dictates what we do here at The Sacred Life. And I guess I will. I'll go ahead and address this real quick. That Irish Breakfast asks, "Why Orthodox? Am I a convert?" And I'll just address that because there's a way that it relates to what we're talking about tonight. That yes, I am a convert to Orthodox, and I am a convert from Mennonite, and that's why I'm talking about Anabaptist and Mennonite history, because that is my own history. I'm deeply, I don't know, kind of like rooted in this story that we're talking about here. My own ancestors were martyrs of the Anabaptist faith, so that's something that's very, very close to me. And as to why Orthodox, I would just suggest to that, go and check out some of our other videos where we talk about that in depth. Anyway, that is all I have tonight. I think my voice is starting to get a little thin, a little worn out. Thanks everybody again for joining us. Until next time, I want to wish you all peace in Christ.